Hello and welcome everybody, and welcome to EmPower Hour. My name is Corey Rosas and I use he, him pronouns. I serve as the program coordinator for UCLA Alumni Diversity Programs and Initiatives, and I am identify as a Latino man with glasses, and I'm wearing today a white t-shirt with black sleeves with a background with UCLA blue and our EmPower Hour logo. Thank you for joining us for our virtual event. And tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Gayane Khechoomian, who will be our moderator for tonight. Gayane is an attorney licensed in the state of California and Illinois. She provides counseling to foreign entities and non-governmental organizations and litigates under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act and Alien Tort Statute in the US federal courts. She previously served as a visiting professional at the International Criminal Court in The Hague and clerked at the United Nations Criminal Tribunal prosecuting genocide and crimes against humanity in Cambodia. Gayane is a graduate of UCLA and Loyola Law School. She has offered over a decade of journalism experience and is a co-founder of the Armenian Chronicles published at UCLA. Take it away, Gayane.
Thank you so much, Corey. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I want to give some context in just a few sentences for the discussion today. It'll be a casual discussion, but in light of recent events, I think it's important. As Armenians, we've grown up with this narrative of survival, and it's been in the context of having gone through a genocide 100 years ago. And, having lived as minorities in another empire and now in different countries, because we're so spread out, most Armenians live outside of Armenia. So we're used to being the minority. And it's kind of instilled in us this struggle for survival almost, it's like an existential struggle. So when in September of last year, when almost the same actors who committed genocide 100 years ago tried again to do the same thing, when Turkey and Azerbaijan essentially waged a war on Armenian native lands, it sort of triggered something in us and how we identify as Armenians. And I think a lot of us wanted to channel our work and our activism into this struggle because of what had happened. And so that's kind of how I want to start the discussion and find out how our identities have played a role in our careers and our education. And especially in light of recent events where I feel like a lot of activity has gone on. So without further ado, I want to introduce all of our panelists, all three of them, starting with Sev Ohanian. Sev Ohanian is an American Armenian screenwriter, and he's the producer native to Los Angeles. His film Searching, that he co-wrote and produced, was released through Sony Screen Gems in the summer of 2018. It grossed $75 million worldwide. He also co-wrote and produced Run for Lionsgate, which stars Sarah Paulson, and it became the most watched film ever on Hulu when it premiered. He also served as executive producer on the Warner Brothers movies Space Jam: A New Legacy and Judas and the Black Messiah. And that film won 2 Academy Awards and was nominated for 6. Sev is a founder of Proximity Media, which is a production company. And in 2018, he received 2 awards, one, the Alfred P. Sloan Feature Film Award, and the Sundance Institute Amazon Studios Narrative Producer Award. We have Ardashes Kassakhian. Mr. Kassakhian, Councilman Kassakhian, actually, he serves on the Glendale City Council. And prior to his election to City Council, he served as the elected city clerk for Glendale for 15 years, having been elected and re-elected 4 times by the voters of Glendale. And before he assumed that office, he was director of government relations and later the executive director of the Armenian National Committee of America Western Region, which is the nation's largest advocacy organization for issues of interest and concern for Armenian Americans. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and he moved to Glendale with his family in 1986, where he grew up and attended public schools and began his life of public service. He graduated from UCLA with a bachelor's degree in history and received his master's degree in public policy and administration from Northwestern University. He recently attended the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and completed the Certificate for Senior Executives in State and Local Government. He is also an alumnus of the Coro Public Affairs Fellowship. A few people know Councilman Kassakhian as a professor because he's an adjunct instructor of political science at Glendale Community College. Next, we have Dr. Ilona Salmons. She is a psychotherapist and a leadership consultant. She works with high-achieving professionals and organizations to promote mental wellness in the workplace by addressing and resolving issues that contribute to chronic stress and burnout. As a former HR manager, she understands the important role that diversity initiatives play in improving overall employee well-being and in high-performance work culture. She received her Bachelor's of Psychology from UCLA in 2007 and her Master's in Clinical Psychology from Pepperdine University. She obtained her doctorate in organizational leadership from Pepperdine University, where she focused on wellness in highly demanding workplaces, and she published her dissertation there. Ilona is a proud Armenian American. She's a political refugee from Baku, whose family had to flee their home when she was just 4 years old. Ilona has been passionate about philanthropy and community activism from a very young age. That is our panel. What I want to do now is let the panelists talk about their backgrounds. I want to know what role your background played in your career and how it shaped your career and how you ended up where you are. Maybe Sev, you can start with how you got started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gayane, and thanks again for having me on this panel with these incredible fellow panelists. So, you know, I'm a filmmaker. I write movies, I produce movies, and I've been doing it ever since I graduated from film school at USC, which is a really great university in Southern California. If you guys are not aware, I guess you weren't aware because you guys are all Bruins. So anyway, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a filmmaker, but you know, growing up even in LA, so close in proximity to Hollywood, it felt like this impossible dream to achieve because I couldn't name a single Armenian in the industry, you know, and as you all probably know, Hollywood's all about connections and all that. So for the longest time, I didn't pursue filmmaking. I pursued journalism, something that I thought was far safer and stabler. But when I was in college, I started making these little YouTube videos with my friends, just poking fun at our Armenian family out of love, like purely out of love. And those videos we put on YouTube, this is like 2007, so it's like prehistoric ages now, but we put them on YouTube, and to my surprise, they started getting thousands and then hundreds of thousands of followers and fans and people sharing them, and people in Germany making their own versions, and people in Australia. And I was so encouraged by the reaction, that I decided to make an entire movie based on these videos that I called My Big Fat Armenian Family. My mom gave me that title name. It was genius. And we made this film. I wrote it, I directed it, I edited it, I shot it, I did everything except for makeup. And I say this all the time, but the makeup artist quit, so I did that too. Horrible makeup. And my friends, my sister, they were all in the movie. We then screened the film at Glendale High School, sold tickets, sold DVDs. And to my shock, it made tons of money. But beyond that, total complete strangers, Armenians, all of them, showed up. They clapped, they laughed, they cried. They really responded to this piece of art that I had made. And it really empowered me and kind of gave me that encouragement, that final bit of courage that I needed to pursue filmmaking as an actual career. And I have never turned back ever since. So to me, it's like my Armenian background really informed everything. It honestly is what inspired me to take this plunge.
I really love your success story because you have like the weight of this community behind you. I really love that. And can you tell us how you ended up in film school at USC?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of examples, but when I was applying for film school, and I imagine a lot of people here know this very well, you have to write personal statements, you have to submit your transcripts and everything. I wrote the most incredible and the most cheesiest and stupidest and clichéest story about how when I was growing up, I was in scouts, I used to go like cliff diving, and I'm gonna dive into college, and it's so cheesy, it was so stupid, but it was also like really well written. I spent 3 weeks on it, typeproofing everything. And then the night the application was due, which was like a 9 p.m. deadline over email, for some reason at like 7:30 p.m., it finally hit me. I'm like, why did I write this? Like, this is so stupid. It's so cliche. It means nothing. It's not who I am. And I don't know what it is, but I had this weird spark of inspiration to write about my identity as an Armenian. And I wrote about how I think there's this misunderstanding of Armenians that, you know, grow up, especially in the American diaspora, that we are all victims of a genocide. And I wrote this rambly, typo written, it makes no sense if you read it like back to back essay about, I want to spend my life fighting that label and not be a victim, but rather be a survivor. And it's probably the worst thing I've ever written, but I submitted it right as the deadline was ticking down. It was like classic. I remember the next morning I read it again, feeling good and being horrified. And then when I got the call from USC, because they do like, you know, they do interviews and stuff like that. I remember when I was getting my scheduled call for my interview was like at 10:30 a.m. So I wore a suit for some reason. It was not Zoom, it was phone call, but I thought if I wore a suit, I might sound more professional. And I was ready to talk about film, because this is supposed to be like the world's best film school. I'm going to talk about Spielberg and this and that. And the only thing the professor wanted to ask me about was that essay. And she said that she was so touched that she had not ever read an essay that was so full of authenticity. And she was really curious and asked about what it must be like to grow up knowing that we were descendants of genocide survivors, and how that can potentially inform creating art and creating anything that is going to further progress our people's stories. So honestly, like, it got me into my dream college, and you know, the rest is history.
That's really great. It sounds like your authenticity sort of shone through. It was shining through in your paper. Ardashes Kassakhian, I'd love to hear your story, how your background influenced your career, how you got into your career, because I know you have a interesting reason for what you do.
Well, thank you very much, Gayane. And I gotta say that I'm a big fan of everyone on this panel. I've been an admirer of all of your work from afar. Gayane, I think you and I have worked more closely together on issues pertaining to Glendale and the Armenian community in the past. But Sev, congratulations on all of your accolades, and I hope it's just the beginning. And to everyone, I'm just humbled to be here. I'll tell you, as far as my pathway, I mean, Sev hit on a couple of interesting points. One is the practicality that Armenian parents, and I think most immigrant parents, try to imbue into their children. And so being a young Armenian American, my parents came here in the late 60s. They came here to pursue their graduate studies. So it wasn't like they came here as refugees, but their parents were refugees as a result of the Armenian genocide. My mom's family from Athens and my father's family from Jerusalem. And, you know, when I was a kid growing up, I wanted to, my dream would have been to be an animator or to be a cartoonist or to be an artist. And my father sat me down one day and was like, son, it's good to follow your dreams, it's good to run after your dreams on a full stomach. And if you're an artist, that's not going to happen. Both my parents are, by the way, chemists. My mom's been a chemistry teacher in Glendale Unified District, now retired. My father was an environmental chemist. And the reason my father, I think, partially went into chemistry is because the family story, our I guess, origin story includes science. My great-grandfather was a pharmacist in Ovacik, which was a small town outside of Istanbul. And when the Turkish authorities made them all pack up everything and march through the desert, the only reason they survived was because the Turkish gendarmes, the guards that were accompanying him, came to him one night and said, look, one of our own has fallen ill. He has a very high fever. We hear you're a pharmacist. If you can bring his fever down, we'll let your family live. If not, you know, you're going to go the same fate as everyone else marching into the desert. He was able to bring his fever down through some penicillin and other medicine that he had stowed away. And then they gave them safe passage to Jerusalem, where they finally escaped the genocide and settled. And so he started the oldest continuously operating pharmacy in the old city of Jerusalem from that point on. And that was kind of the family legend, that you have to go into the sciences. You need to have practical skills to survive in this world. Well, when in college, I got into UCLA with a chemistry major, but I quickly switched to history because I found that's where my passion was. As an Armenian, not having grown up around a lot of Armenians back east, and even when I came to Glendale, not really being so closely associated with the more recent community, it was a bit of a culture shock going to UCLA and taking Armenian history classes and learning that our people's history was more realistic than just the legends and myths and stories that we had all grown up with. And it was at that time at UCLA that we had an encounter with the Turkish Republic, the Republic of Turkey, trying to donate $1.5 million to establish a chair of Turkish studies, Ottoman studies at UCLA. $1.5 million, the irony of which is, I'm sure, not lost on anyone, but it was going to be essentially a pulpit for them through which they could propagate their denial and whitewash their own history using the good name of the University of California. Well, as a member of the student activist groups, we got up and we fought tooth and nail to make sure that people knew what this money was going to be used for. The history department voted to turn down the funds by a vote of 18-17. And I think that was in no part, a small part, due to the student activism, which then led me to go to Washington, D.C. and intern for a member of Congress, Frank Pallone, because of our student activism and seeing that we were interested in this issue because it was happening all over the country. When I was in Washington, D.C., I saw that there weren't a lot of Armenian Americans in politics. Any room that I would go into on the Hill or anywhere else, I would either be the only Armenian or maybe one of two Armenian Americans. And so when I came back, it was during that same time when there was this political awakening in Glendale, which happens to be the highest concentration of Armenian Americans in the United States, not outside of Armenia, but in the US. And I started working on campaigns. And I started working on campaigns to give a community that was underrepresented a voice, not just Armenians, but many underrepresented communities, whether it's by age, gender, ethnicity, whatever the case may be. And I think the one thing I would say that has driven me in politics that has to do with my heritage is this idea of being an oppressed part of a community that was oppressed, persecuted. And the fact that, I think as Armenians, and I don't know if any of my co-panelists would agree, as an Armenian, I found myself always rooting for the underdog in any situation. It's, I think, something very characteristic of Armenians because we've been history's ultimate underdog. We're currently history's underdog with what's happening in Armenia. And I think when you talk about most people, why they get into public service, it's to serve justice, just as you have Gayane, it's to fight for what's right. And I think that is always the case when someone is being picked on and when someone is being persecuted. And, I always say, like, we're part of an endangered group on this planet. Around the entire globe, there's 10 million Armenians, and I'm including the Agassiz and the Shares and the Kardashians. Whereas in LA County, we have like 13 million people. There's more people living in LA County than there are Armenians around the whole globe. And so that's what has driven me and continues to drive me in public service. And it's in no small part to my ethnicity and my cultural heritage.
Well, thank you for the work.
Can I just interject? Artie, you just gave me chills because my whole life, I've never been able to put into words what you just said, that we relate to the underdogs. Like, that is so true. Like, wow, man, you're such a wordsmith. That's amazing.
It's why we've been Dodger fans for so long, right? It's except for last year when they finally.
Thank you so much for the work you did at UCLA. I mean, I remember hearing about those events, the $1.5 million, in case it was lost on our audience, the 1.5 million is the number of people killed in the Armenian genocide. So Turkey donating that amount, it's not a coincidence. It's almost psychological warfare, so to speak. Dr. Salmons, if you could please tell us your story, share a bit about your background and how it influenced your career.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel today with Armenian superstars. So both of what Sev and Ardashes said resonated with me and are parts of my story, and specifically like the practical aspect of coming from an immigrant family and specifically being refugees coming to this brand new country and not knowing language, not knowing any other person. We didn't have any family here, and being put into South Dakota. So the way that the relocation process works is that if you don't have family here, they just, I don't know, I think they throw a dart on the map and see where it lands. And it landed in South Dakota. So our family was moved there. And there were a few other Armenian families there also from Baku who shared a similar fate. But I got a lot of messages around the importance of education growing up. And my parents really knew that education was going to be what would get our family out of the situation that we were in, that it would provide for a more stable future for us, the kids, and for my parents as well. and provide that financial stability as well, which is very important. So growing up, I got a lot of messages around like picking a career that could be financially stable, a prestigious career so that you can make a lot of money. So not just, you know, stable, but not making that much money so that you can, again, support your family and support yourself and not have to worry about money. But also doing something that could potentially, if you had to just pick up and pack everything and run away to another country again, that you could build your life back more quickly, having the education and having the financial means. And so growing up, a lot of the options were, you know, the traditional things like being a doctor, being a lawyer, and my brother and sister are both attorneys actually. And so growing up, I really wanted to be a doctor. Until I went to UCLA, I started to take some classes, and unlike Ardashes, I'm not as good in chemistry as your parents were. So I had to take some chemistry classes. I had to take some biology classes. I didn't like any of them because they didn't have to do with people. They didn't have to do with people, and I really wanted to help people. I really wanted to learn how I could work with people, and that's when I took a psychology class. And at that point, I realized that this is how I could help people. I could work with people on the psychological aspect and support them in that way, not so much on the physical aspect. And I guess, as they say, the rest is history. And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of Armenians in my profession as well, which I've appreciated. And I think for Armenians, it's helpful to have an Armenian clinician or a mental health professional who can understand the story, who can understand the history of our people, who can understand the intergenerational trauma. I recently visited Armenia, I guess a year before the pandemic. And I had this realization similar to what Sev had many, many years ago when he applied to USC. As I was walking through the Genocide Memorial, and I was walking through the museum, and I was looking at all these photos and reading all these stories, it became so clear to me in that moment that while we have this trauma in our history, and often we talk about the trauma, and I think a lot of what people in the greater community, not just Armenians, but outside of Armenians, often hear about Armenians or Armenia is this like this trauma language about our genocide and these types of things. But we also have such a rich culture, and we come from a history of people who had this will to survive. They experienced the unimaginable. They saw the most darkest part of humans, right? What humans are capable of doing. And they had this will to survive. And so my great grandmother was a survivor of the genocide. She lost her entire family in the genocide. She must have been close to my age when my family had to flee from Azerbaijan, just 4 or 5 years old. And I realized that she experienced this trauma from such a young age, but she had this will to just survive and to keep living for herself and for her community and for the people around her. And so it reframed that for me, that I recognized in that moment that myself and many of us are, we have the warrior blood, right, that courses through our veins. We have this strength. And so while we have the trauma is not what defines us. It's something that happened. What defines us is our strength. What defines us is this will to continue to live and survive and also thrive. Like we celebrate, we love life. Armenians really love life and to celebrate and to do parties and family gatherings and all of these things. And I think especially in the context of our history, it's just so much more powerful.
I really love that we're, warriors. I know that you thought about issues surrounding stigma in the Armenian community, which, our issues are different maybe from other issues. Do you want to talk about maybe Armenian specific issues that you deal with, maybe in light of the recent war and that sort of trauma? Is there anything that you can shed light on that interests you in your career?
In many ways, Armenians are different because of our unique history, but in many ways we're similar. And so I think we can relate to any other people of color group or a minority group or an oppressed group, because while the details of our stories might be different, the themes overlap, right? And again, it's this like will to overcome and to do better and to support others. With the recent war, I think what was especially challenging for a lot of people is that happened toward the end, or I guess middle, since we're still in the pandemic, toward this part of like months and months into global pandemic, where many of us were already psychologically pretty stressed out, having to deal with whatever were the repercussions of that for our families specifically, but also more globally. And then the time that this happened, I think for many of us, our resources were already depleted. And so it was very challenging to then re-energize ourselves to try to support the community the best as we could. in the context of the global pandemic, in the context of this very unjust war, in the context of all of the terrible things that we were hearing and seeing and the helplessness that we felt. And so it was very much re-traumatizing for a lot of people. I know for my family, it was re-traumatizing in a different way, given that this is a war started by Azerbaijan, and my family fled from Azerbaijan when I was very little. But the history of the trauma is something that comes into play for sure, because when it comes to trauma, it's passed down from generation to generation, both in our genes. So in the field of epigenetics, they really study of how genes are turned on and off depending on the environment, as well as in the environment that we grow up in. So the way that we are parented, for instance, has a lot to do with, more, in some cases, like more authoritarian type of parenting, just because you have to listen to the parent because it could potentially be life and death, right? Given that, as you mentioned, Gayane, we grew up in communities where we were minorities and often treated like second-class citizens. And so this trauma gets passed down from generation to generation. And if it's not addressed and something like the war happens, it can come to the surface and people may not even understand where it's coming from, especially for Armenians who moved here maybe generations ago and who haven't personally experienced that type of trauma themselves. And so it's important for each of us to make sure that we're getting the support that we need just to better our community in general, but also to be prepared for when things like this happen. Because if we have multiple generations ago, some trauma that happened in this big collective trauma of the Armenian genocide, and nobody since then has gotten therapy, right? I know that my great grandmother didn't get therapy. I know that her mom didn't, my parents didn't. Eventually these things just get passed down, and somebody has to be willing to do the work and to break that intergenerational trauma. And again, part of the reframing can be helpful as well, so that we don't only see ourselves as victims, we see ourselves as survivors, but we also see ourselves as warriors. Again, this group of people, this small group of people that had this will to continue to survive and to continue to live, but also to give back, which is something that I see a lot in the Armenian community. Many of us have this like drive to make the world a better place for other people.
I like how you frame that. Mental health is part of the process of even like we think of reparations, we think of activism, but mental health is part of our strengthening our community. I have a question about basically, I want to know if any of you have ever felt pressure to use your platform, your power, or your skills to benefit the Armenian community or causes from other people. Sometimes we look at people who become successful and we think, well, they should be doing this, they should be doing that. Do you feel that pressure, and how have you felt it if you felt it?
I mean, I can speak a little bit about that. I wouldn't call it pressure. It's pressure to me is something that almost you feel obligated to do. I think for me, it feels something that comes natural. I think, everybody exists on this planet. We're all from one tribe or another. And I think it's part of our reason for being here is to kind of help amplify the needs of our people. And to me, I think especially being in a position where I'm privileged enough to be able to make content, entertainment at its core, but I think part of what becomes like like today's movies are the oral traditions of our ancestors, right? Like this is like pop culture and all that. It kind of helps. I've never been to Baltimore my entire life, but I've watched The Wire, so I feel like I know it. So I think, as storytellers and filmmakers, we have a responsibility. I've always had the dream, like I imagine many Armenian filmmakers, to make some kind of definitive film or piece of content that'll tell our story and do what it can to like make sure our ancestors are heard. But for me, I've been kind of always playing the long game, because I've seen so often Armenian films have come out, or filmmakers, and they've made something that's been about the genocide or been about our people, but it hasn't quite gotten the splash that it could have or should have. So for me, it's always been a matter of, I was a member of Home and Arat Scouts for like a long time. It's actually where Gayane and I got really close. And the motto that they always taught us from Home and, which is Bar Tatsir, Bar Tatsur, which, to translate it means lift yourself so that then you can lift others. So I've always had this like secret mission that once I've established, and once there's been a couple of trophies, and once there's been a couple of box office records broken, then will be the time, to make a good piece of entertainment that'll work, but something that'll actually amplify our cause. And I think that time is close for me. So in a long answer, yes.
I've seen your resume. I think you're there, Sev. We've all seen it. Thank you for that. That's yeah. I think maybe pressure is the wrong word. Maybe do you feel a duty, or maybe some people feel pressured. Any other panelists have an opinion on that?
My answer is very short, because I think I live with that every day. I live in a city and serve a city that's about 38–40% Armenian, and whether I want to or not, I'm doing something in some way to help the community. But outside of that, I'll give you one example with the current situation with the POWs and the civilians that are being illegally held captive by the Azerbaijani government. There is a number of people who approached us and asked us to speak out. Now, I had spoken out about it individually. I'd contacted members of Congress, the ones I knew, and both the one who represents us. But it's very difficult for me to delve into. For local governments, if you understand how local government works, once you delve into a particular area of foreign policy, the question is, where do you draw the line? If you do it for the Armenian American community, what other injustices do you do? And it becomes this issue of approach. Like, does everything become about doing actions and symbolic actions that may not add up to much to address all of the wrongs? Now, on the other hand, I'll tell you, if it's something related to Glendale, I'm very much about, because of my Armenianness, because of that acute compass that can identify injustice or try to fight it wherever it may occur. We did pass a resolution after the murder of George Floyd, acknowledging Glendale's racist past. And anyone who's familiar with Glendale knows that there's a horrendous past, including it being home and headquarters of the American Nazi Party for decades. So it becomes this balance of how far do you go? Where do you go? And what is the ultimate interest that you're trying to serve? I take my constitutional responsibilities as an elected official of Glendale very seriously. And I'm always aware that everything that I do that helps Armenians, and I believe this, if we're being good Armenians, we're being good Americans. And if, when Sev is telling a great story on the screen, he may be telling the story of Black Americans, but it's also the story of Armenians, and it's all intertwined. I mean, you take the Black Panther story. The defense attorney for Bobby Seale and Huey Newton was an Armenian American attorney, Charles Gary, born Garabedian. And the whole reason why in a documentary, multiple documentaries, 2 documentaries about his life, when they ask him, why were you as a white person acting as a defense attorney for these 2 quote unquote radical Black activists? He said, because I grew up in Fresno and I got my ass kicked every day. And I knew what it was like to be a Black person, even though I could change my name and then just immerse myself in white America. So, I mean, I think like being a good Armenian and serving Armenians is also serving America. When we talk about help Armenia or help Artsakh, we're also talking about, hey, America, wake up. Your allies in NATO, who you think they are, they're not who you really think they are. Historically, we have a long memory being a people of over 5,000, 10,000 years. And I wish more people would listen to us. I wish more people would pay attention to the things that we're saying. Unfortunately, it doesn't occur. And one of the things that Dr. Salmons mentioned about the inherited trauma, you look at what happened right now in this last war, beheadings in the 21st century. Not to ask the rhetorical question, who does that? But it's been happening for 100 years. My familiarity and introduction to the Armenian genocide as a child was seeing Black and white photos of the same ethnic group beheading this ethnic group, my ethnic group. And you flash forward, no matter how much our technology has advanced, whatever we're using to communicate with each other, however smart we think we are as a species, that's still happening. So some things haven't been resolved and they need to be resolved. And we, fortunately, I find myself, the one thing I'll cap this off with and say, as Armenian Americans, we have a great opportunity to live in a country that affords us many, many freedoms and rights to be able to speak out and to amplify our voices, not just for ourselves, but for others, as Sev has done, as Dr. Salmons have done, and as you do, Gayane, around the world.
I really like the way you put it. Being good Armenians makes you good Americans. And the way I look at things in my work, in my field is, my law firm brings cases. We have a case against Turkey that touches on reparations, return to native lands in Turkey. We have a case against the drone manufacturer that sold weapon parts to Turkey that were allegedly used in the war. And the way I look at it is, one, being Armenian, I'm in the best position to do that advocacy because I understand the issues, right? Maybe I wouldn't be as good of an advocate for another people. But I look at it also as paving the way for providing resolutions to injustices across the board. You know, like the way that our cases maybe are inspired by Native American land rights, American Native Americans here. You know, I look at those cases and I can see similarities. Like Dr. Salmons says, you know, in some ways we're different. Armenians are different, but in other ways we're similar. It's kind of that idea. And so I like to think that if I'm paving the way for Armenian reparations or Armenian rights, it will sort of inspire, it'll sort of trickle down those rights and help humanity in a way. So that's how I look at it. I like how you said that. Dr. Salmons, would you like to chime in on this?
We've moved so far from the question, I don't remember what the original question was.
Oh, let me actually segue into the, Councilman Kassakhian mentioned something about, you know, Charles Gary was able to just change his name and adopt whiteness. Something interesting is sometimes people change their names. And, you know, I know, Councilman, you go by a nickname, Artie. And you had an interesting story about that you told me yesterday. If you could maybe share that.
I'll be brief because I want to give everyone else an opportunity to talk. My whole life, even though I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and grew up in New Jersey, and the closest Armenian neighbors were, you know, or Armenians were an hour's drive away, and it would become this big ceremonial thing where we'd have to put on our nicest sweaters and bow ties and go over and be forced to play with kids who were Armenian, but we didn't really like. Like, I didn't grow up around anyone that could pronounce my name correctly, yet I made it a point to make sure that people did. First of all, I was very upset about it. I remember coming home from kindergarten, and in kindergarten, you wear your name like with a piece of yarn on the first day. And everyone else had these nice little short tags, name tags. And I was like Christ carrying the cross up Calvary, you know, like an albatross around my neck. And I asked my parents, why did you do this? I remember to this day them saying, look, you're growing up in America. You're going to be an American. We can't control who you marry. But the one thing your parents give you that you carry with you wherever you go that you can't get rid of is your name. And your name should remind you of your roots. So for anyone who knows Armenian history, Ardashes is probably the most authentic of Armenian and rarest of Armenian names. I mean, there's others out there that are as rare, but it's a mouthful. But I ran to school the next day and started lecturing my friends on the playground about Noah's Ark and Mount Ararat and like what Armenians were and their contributions, and, you know, came up with my elevator pitch, which has evolved over the years about who Armenians are. But when I got to Glendale, and especially when I got involved in government and I was lobbying folks on Capitol Hill and the White House on issues of aid to Artsakh and aid to Armenia when I used to work for the Armenian National Committee, sometimes you only get 15 minutes with these people and you don't have the luxury of teaching them how to pronounce Ardashes. And so you want to come up with something that's snappy. And my name wasn't as important as were the regions in Artsakh that were, you know, under threat, or the regions in Armenia that needed aid. So I became Artie as a result of service to my country, but I'll tell you, my non-Armenian friends who've known me the longest still call me Ardashes or Ardashes. Ironically, since running for office, also it fits better on a lawn sign, most people have come to know me as Artie.
That's great. It's like a practical sort of reason, which is why at Starbucks, I'm Diana, you know, for the sake of efficiency.
That's awesome. I agree. And just to piggyback off of Ardash's answer, mine is very similar. You know, I'm in the film industry and I don't have time for people to say my real name is Sevok, but like Sevok, Sevix, I was like, how is that hard to pronounce? Like I saw a tweet the other day, like Americans can say Daenerys Targaryen, no problem, but Sevok or Ardashes, like forget about it. So for me, it was always like I've always had this, like, this is an exclusive here, but like I'm waiting for the day to like rechange my name back to Sevok on a movie poster and make, you know how like Cher kept retiring and then she kept coming back? Like it's gonna happen. And I think I know exactly which movie, but Sev, you know, lucky number Sevy Sev, like it just all helped me, I think, get a little bit of notoriety, because I think there's only one Sev right now in Hollywood. So it's been working so far, but one day we'll get back.
I think your names are very catchy. But how, what do you think maybe is like a big threat to preserving your Armenian identity? You know, you can change your name, but what is, in your opinion, a threat?
I'd like to contribute to this one. I think a general threat, maybe not specific to me only, but a threat to preserving any identity or Armenian identity is this false notion that there's one right way to be Armenian, and it's like very rigid and strict. And so I mentioned how my family was moved to South Dakota, and then eventually, really from day one, my parents just wanted to get out of there, but of course it took time to build their life back up. And so eventually we moved to Glendale because we knew that's where all the Armenians hang out. And so when we moved to Glendale and I started Glendale High School in the 9th grade, I had a culture shock in a completely different way, because now instead of being like one or of a few Armenians in my school and they're all my family, now I'm in this pool of Armenian people, and I didn't fit in either. And so it was a culture shock in a different way, because now I'm this like Americanized Armenian person who doesn't know so much about her culture. I don't speak the language either, because in Azerbaijan, everybody spoke Russian. And so my parents are far more fluent in Russian. And so we never learned Armenian growing up. And I kept getting this question over and over again. Do you speak Armenian? And then I would say no. And then people were confused by how I was Armenian. My classmates were confused how I was Armenian if I didn't speak the language. And so I just started to feel like I wasn't Armenian enough because I didn't have this language. And so I noticed that in our community, sometimes we try to separate one another, or you're only like half Armenian, or you're not married to an Armenian, or whatever it might be. And my mindset is completely different. If you're, I don't know, 7 generations ago, you had an Armenian grandma, to me, you're Armenian. Like, that's all it takes. If you hang out with Armenians, you're Armenian. If you've been to an Armenian wedding, you're Armenian, right? And so we really just need to broaden what it means to be Armenian and accept that there's not one right way to be Armenian. And I think we can bring more people into our culture in that way, and to focus on all of the beautiful things, again, about our culture and about our people and about our history, and just to help people be Armenian in whatever way it means to them. If they just moved and they're more traditional Armenian, if they've been here for generations and they're, far more Westernized or Americanized, just allowing that to be okay.
Yeah, that's definitely something that, I've experienced that as well. When I moved here, I was 12, 13 years old. I moved here from Sweden. So Glendale was a culture shock for me as well. And I did get a lot of that. And I think I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and I said, isn't it funny how everyone has that story that they feel like they've been told they're not Armenian enough, they don't fit in? I feel like everybody's heard that. So what does that leave? Like 10 Armenians, So I think it's important to shy away from that. I'm actually curious to hear about something more positive. Have you had an experience where your career, your skills, you've used them to achieve something positive? Maybe you touched someone's life, or you've inspired someone. Like, for example, Sev, you're in an industry where you're kind of you're alone when your identity. I mean, there aren't that many people. I can't really think of many people in your position in LA that are doing what you do. Can you talk about any, instances of something cool that you've inspired, maybe?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, my wife, Natalie Kassakhian, is also a producer in this industry, so it's not that lonely, which is great. And it's funny, when I was trying to think of the way, this is totally offshoot, I was going to try and ask her parents for the privilege of marrying her. This is like a few years ago. My whole spiel was going to be how, like, there's this notion that there's plenty of fish in the sea. And like, for me, it was like, really, there was only one fish. It was like the fellow Armenian who's making movies in Hollywood. But, her parents didn't even let me give that speech. But to answer your question, in a really funny full circle way, like, when I was working on this film, Judas and the Black Messiah, and this is the true story about an incredible young man named Chairman Fred Hampton, who was a member of the Black Panther Party in Chicago in the 60s. And there's a movie that we made. It came out earlier this year. It's the one that got a couple of Oscars. One of my responsibilities as a creative producer was to really work with Chairman Fred's son and his widow, who are still very much alive and they're very active in activism today. And I was kind of, one of my jobs was to work with them and bring them to our movie and try and earn their trust as we made a film about, this incredible man in their lives and their story, especially one that is wrought with trauma, like Dr. Salmons was saying. And when I was trying to figure out how could I connect with these people who are, African-American activists who have been persecuted, who've been traumatized themselves, how could I possibly engage with them as a young, Hollywood producer? And to Ardash's point, I'm like, hey, I'm Armenian. Do you guys even know what Armenian is? And they were like, we love Armenians. Charles Gary, he was incredible. He got us out of jail. And it was really nice that like, just like speaking of intergenerational trauma, like the fact that like intergenerational like success and valiance is also what helped me in that case, you know, like kind of full circle, that like these people had a pre-existing love of me. And it's funny, one of the things that we often talk when the Artsakh war was happening, and I was so sad about obviously all the things that were happening, and I ended up confiding in these Black Panthers about it because we were at this point working on our movie's press. And one thing that they said that really resonated with me was, in the case of the Black Panther Party, who for decades were assassinated by the government and clearly propagandized against, they said their bullets killed us, but their words hurt us. And it really brought to my mind like the indisputable power of propaganda and how it's affected so many underdogs over time, and it's what really hurt me so much. And it was the one thing I tried my best to try and combat against these past couple months. I think for me, like I know, like one positive thing out of our community is that I do think, again on theme, like we have come together in ways, over the past couple months that I've met so many brilliant people over the past couple of months. Apologies, guys. That I do feel an optimism for the future that I haven't felt in a long time, and it's honestly thanks to incredible leaders in our community, like Artie and so many others who have been able to rally, like that story you said, and the ending being that it was a vote of 18-17. That is so insane, man. Like, and it just almost wants to make me compelled to work that much harder to help support all these incredible people who are doing all the work. Sorry for that wrong, rambly answer, but that's truly how I feel.
Oh, that's really great.
I'll just say that to me, being Armenian, it's summed up by a quote by Gayane Khechoomian. If any of you know, he was one of the most successful NCAA basketball coaches, led the University of Nevada, Las Vegas to a championship. If you get a chance, it's really, truly great to read his autobiography. It's called, I think I put Running Rebel, Shark Tales of Extra Benefits, Frank Sinatra and Winning It All. And in it, he has this one line, because he talks about his experience. I mean, he went up against the NCAA and they called him all sorts of racist and bigoted things, like a rug merchant and you name it, all these tropes and insults. But in it, he talks about his Armenian heritage. And it's actually his Armenian heritage that helped him transform the game of basketball as we know it today. Well, first of all, he says, I'm an Armenian. That doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but to Armenians, it means everything. And I think that's important because we find these touchstones throughout history that help us move forward. Every time I find a roadblock or an issue I'm struggling to understand, whether it's LGBT rights or, the Black Lives Matters movements, I will find something that will compel me to say, aha, I'm connecting with that. And it's because of my Armenian experience. In the case of Gayane Khechoomian, he was going after junior college kids and kids who had troubled backgrounds that the top universities were not recruiting to play basketball. He started off coaching basketball at Pasadena City College and then at Riverside Community College. First coach and only coach ever to win back-to-back championships at two different schools. Went on to Long Beach State, then to almost beat UCLA's top team, actually one of Wooden's top teams with this ragtag team, because he was giving young Black Americans these opportunities that no one else was, because he knew how he had struggled as an Armenian, as a child of survivors. And there's countless stories like this. And I think that that inspires us. And if I can do a quarter of what the Armenians that have come before us have done, I'll be happy. I mean, I'm just worried about being a good person and a politician who keeps his name out of the headlines for all the wrong reasons. If the next generation looks at Sev and Dr. Salmons and myself and to you, Gayane, and says, I want to be like them, then we've already accomplished a lot. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of stories, there's hundreds and hundreds of stories we can go through, but I look to the folks that come before us and never forget that each of us is standing on the shoulders of giants who came before us with greater struggles, with trauma, and we're still able to carve out a life and an existence and make the American dream come true for them.
Yeah, definitely agree. I've had a lot of role models as well, but they're my contemporaries, let's say, and so but I do look, by the way, Sev, I did not mean to forget Natalie. You and your wife are truly a power couple in your field. I absolutely love how you work together. And I look forward to seeing, now we have a woman role model as well, who's Armenian. So I think that's really great. But I do consider all of you pioneers in your field. I really do. And I think there's a younger generation of people that will look up to you, maybe not even just Armenian, anyone who's maybe from a minority background or hasn't seen themselves in the position where you are. Because sometimes when you see somebody in a position where you want to be, you say, hey, maybe I can do that too. Is there anyone like that you've seen, that you've looked at and said, well, if they did it, I can do it? Maybe they weren't Armenian.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
Like in terms of people other outside of the Armenian culture that have inspired us?
Maybe like a minority, like who did you look to that was somebody that was your role model?
I mean, everyone from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X to Mahatma Gandhi to Leonard Peltier. I mean, the cause of, I'll tell, I gave this speech recently. I gave a talk on April 23rd, the night before the announcement by the White House about the Armenian genocide, where they actually use the genocide word. And I quoted an Irish poet because I feel like as an Armenian, given our experience, I connect with Irish people because of their history of oppression and genocide, as well, just as I do with First Nation peoples and others. And so like I gravitate to those writers. And I said, I quote William Butler Yeats, who's someone I've admired. He has a great quote. He said, do not wait until the iron is hot to strike it, but make it hot by striking it. And I felt like the recognition of the Armenian genocide was the result of every activist, everyone on this panel, and everyone who over the years, after failed and let down, we just never stopped and kept striking it until the White House finally decided to come on the right side of history. Now, whether William Butler Yeats wrote that because of a similar shared experience of British oppression, just as we've been oppressed by the Turks and other peoples, who knows? But I find those connections all over the place all the time. And I think it has to do, going back to what my original statement was, just really connecting with the underdog in any situation.
Yeah, that's so important. We just had the recognition of the genocide, and it wasn't just overnight. I mean, it came from years and years of work and struggle of people who kept that issue alive, and they thought it was important enough, right? People who didn't come from Armenia necessarily, and thought it was important enough to work towards that sort of an outcome. And I mean, I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the community for doing that, and all the allies who supported it. Are there any questions from the audience? Because I think we're nearing the end. And I know Councilman has a meeting to go serve our city.
I wouldn't want this discussion to end on the account that I'm not part of it. I feel like there's so much. I wish I partly want to play hooky, don't tell anyone in council chambers, and continue to listen to Sev and Dr. Salmons and you.
Okay, we have a question.
Continue the discussion.
We have two questions. Maybe one, each of us can take one. As famous Armenians, how do you teach your children Armenian and Armenian culture?
I don't have any children, so I'll be taking notes.
So I am a father of a 6-year-old, 6.5. We decided to name him Armen. My wife is not Armenian. The way we decided Armen is we wrote down a bunch of Armenian names and then showed it to a waiter at a restaurant and asked him to pronounce each one. And the one that she pronounced correctly was kind of the one we went with. And in all reality, he's also named after my closest friend from childhood, Armen Panosian, and it's just a name that we really liked. My wife liked Antranik, but she didn't want him to be called Andy. In terms of how we keep him Armenian, I don't know if his example is as good of one as the one I grew up with, because here in Glendale, we have 2 public schools that offer dual immersion Armenian and English. And so my son is in kindergarten right now, but already knows how to recite both the English and Armenian alphabet and can write, rudimentary, but he's learning that, which is a great asset. So that's a plug for people to move to Glendale and send their kids to Armenian American or Glendale Public Schools. But I think when you're away from Armenians, anything you can do, and through the internet now and through the mediums such as this, that where you can learn the language, practice it, learn the culture, learn the traditions. It's going to be unique to every family, but those things help because they become the things that you remember and become part of your own personal family culture. So I think that's critical.
Thank you for sharing that. I really like that story. The one that was pronounceable, but Anchanik is a great name as well. So, you know, dibs. I think we're at the end of the panel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I don't think we have any more questions. So really appreciate you sharing your stories. I can't wait to hear more about all the cool stuff you're doing. And thank you for everyone for listening.